Hello, and welcome to episode 29 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is John Dinning down in LA.
John, how are you today?
Doing all right, man, although I think you and I are both a little worse for wear.
Yes.
I'm exhausted.
You have good reason to be exhausted, though.
I suppose I do. Yeah. Long weekend in Manhattan.
New York City for you.
That was it.
Did you have some fun up there?
We had too much fun. Yeah, I'm paying for it.
I noticed that your drink tonight was a direct relation to New York City.
Yeah, I didn't want to drink this, but I felt like I kind of owed it. I'm having a Manhattan.
I think it's a pretty classic choice.
Yeah, cherry-free Manhattan. I don't have any garnishes here.
You don't like fruit in the house, as what I've heard.
I'm fruity enough.
That's what I always tell people. They're like, would you like fruit with your, Bacardi and diet? And I'm like, no.
Nope, I got that covered.
I tonight am drinking a Moscow Mule.
Yeah, what inspired that?
It's a drink I like a lot.
Fair enough.
And somebody gifted us those little copper cups that
Nice. Yeah.
are the classic thing to use for them. So it's also one of the few drinks that I can get in the town that I live in that's consistently well made.
There you go. Yeah, those little goblet cups are cool.
Yeah, they are. Everybody in this town likes to use very specialized liqueurs that they brew at home, which makes a lot of sense because obviously it's wine country. Mm-hmm. But if I want like a White Russian with straight Kahlua, trying to find Kahlua in this town is weird. A treasure hunt.
Why? Any idea?
Yeah, they all make their own coffee infused
I
liqueur.
get it. Yeah.
And I'm like, look, I like sugar, man. And you don't put sugar in that, so this is not cool with me.
I feel you. Well, good. Enjoy. I like Moscow Mules, so I'm on board with that. Yeah. The song?
The song tonight relates to the topic, and this is the fourth and final part of our discussion of flaw in the reasoning questions. And in the first three parts, we actually went through all the different flaws, or many of them that you see on the LSAT. I'd say the most common ones. So if you haven't listened to those episodes yet, I would suggest going back and going through those.
Yeah, that's the place to begin for sure.
It really is. But when we first began talking about this, we said, look, we're going to go through all these flaws that show up on this test, and then we're going to talk about what to do when there is no flaw that you spot or no obvious flaw that you actually see. And so that's tonight's topic.
Right.
And in relation to that, the song that we have chosen is a song from a few years back. It's from 30 Seconds to Mars, and the song is A Beautiful Lie, which I think is...
Yeah, that's kind of perfect.
Kind of perfect for like a stimulus that you read and you're like, oh, everything looks good. And then all of a sudden that turns out to be a lie and there's a flaw in it.
Not so beautiful at that point.
Not so beautiful. And it's funny because you and I have actually seen 30 Seconds to Mars play live.
Kind of.
Yeah, that's kind of. We were going down to Shoreline Amphitheater, which is down by Palo Alto and Mountain View, and got caught in a traffic jam. So I think we caught the last song of their set.
From the parking lot, basically, yeah.
He was doing a Jesus pose. And we're like, look, there he is. And then that was the end of the concert.
When is he
At
not?
least their portion of it.
Right.
They were opening for Muse.
Muse was amazing, as always.
They were very good. Although, to be honest, I don't love seeing them outside in non-stadium environments. The show isn't quite as good. But that's just a personal thing.
I'll take what I can get.
Yes, indeed.
Speaking of what we get, you want to talk about the LSAT world for a minute?
I do want to talk about the LSAT world. That's one of my favorite things to talk about.
It's kind of what we're doing here.
Yes, it is.
I guess first thing is score release, right? October 14th, Monday?
Monday, October 14th, probably around 9 a.m. So at this point, you're looking at just a little over 10 days for that to actually come out, something to keep in mind. Which is funny because at this point, some people have not taken the LSAT, which we will talk about in just a minute very briefly. But as far as the LSAT world, other than just sitting here and waiting for the results of this test and for LSAC to sit down and actually get it all done, LSAC themselves have been pretty busy. They have put out one of their famous podcasts. This was podcast number 11. Of keeping up to data for September of 2019.
Yep.
Comes in at a world record length of 2 minutes and 36 seconds.
2.5 minutes. Nice work.
Again, we'd already be off the air if we were limited to that.
Yeah.
Mostly this was about data, though, which I suppose is fitting with the name of that podcast.
Right.
And they talked about how many test takers they had in July. They released finally the official figures, which was about 23,000. We already knew that about half of those test takers had canceled their scores, which is really amazing if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 50% of the people who saw their scores said, I'm out.
Yeah, I think more people canceled this year than took it last year in July.
That's unbelievable, really.
Yeah.
But one of the things that it has pointed to, and they talk a little bit about this, at least from a data standpoint, is that it appears at this point that the number of people who have taken the LSAT in this cycle is lower than last year.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I say appears because we don't have all the data yet. There's 2 more tests in this calendar year, and that's October and November, whereas last year they only had 1 more test at this time,
right,
which was November. So it appears that numbers are trending down, but if there's a pretty big group in October and November, then it will actually make it up. And the reason that matters to anybody who's listening is you really want to be applying in a year where there are fewer applicants than there were the previous year.
Sure.
Because obviously that makes you slightly more desirable just because there's fewer of you.
Yeah, it's a competition thing.
Yeah, exactly. If you're going to try to, win a 100-yard dash, do you want to compete against, 25,000 people or just 5 people? I mean, typically 5, unless it's like Usain Bolt or something. 5 bolts and you.
But, yeah, I think by the end of the year, the numbers will have actually caught up. But for now, October's looking a little bit lower than November last year was.
Yeah, and it'll depend, too, on the number of first-time takers, which has a big impact as well. So that was the first blog that they put out. Then they put out another blog about how the digital LSAT will shape the LSAT of the future. And you can see that right now what's happening with them is they're taking like a look back and then a look forward.
Right.
Because the transition, this is it. This is easily one of the biggest years in the history of LSAC. And they did talk about the first LSAT that was administered in 1948. And I had seen this fact before, but of course forget it all the time. That test had more than 500 questions, and it took all day to complete.
Yeah. People now think they have it bad.
Back then it was far worse. Of course, probably a lot fewer people taking it too.
True that.
They also mentioned something that you and I have expressed surprise that they talked about, which was, and I'll quote from them, they're talking about the digital LSAT, and they said that among the first areas our experts will research are how test takers allocate their time per question and how tools such as eliminating answer choices or flagging questions for review are being used.
Right.
Now, we expected them to do that, in part because as we've built our digital platform and we spent a lot of time and money doing that, we began to build in the ability to see how much time someone would spend on a question.
Yeah, granular level tracking.
Exactly. And from a preparation standpoint, in the future, this will be extremely helpful because we'll be able to go to test takers and say, look what happened here. You got caught up on this third question of this game and took so much time that it caused you not to get to the fourth game. We'll be able to look at things that happen. Or, you were looking at this logical reasoning question and it appears that you just stopped when you were looking at answer choice B. And you never really got to answer choice D, or you didn't give it much of a read. You just eliminated it very quickly thereafter. So you kind of had decided before you got there instead of giving it a fair shake.
Sure.
And so from a preparation standpoint, this will be incredibly helpful. And obviously the way we see our job here is to try to assist people, to make them better test takers, more knowledgeable, better armed. But keep in mind that in a sense, and maybe more than a sense, this is a battle. This is a war. They're going to use that very same data and come up with ways to catch people and to force them into making mistakes.
It lets them make the test harder, more deceptive. If you're a test taker, I don't want them to have this information about me or you.
No. They're able to gather it every single time that they administer a test. We know that. There's nothing that anyone can do about that.
You can't help test day, but...
Yeah, and certainly using their familiar tool, which there's 3 free LSATs there, so you have to say use it. They're collecting data there as well.
Yeah.
So it's going to become something where they get even better at what they do. And as I've said many times, I have the highest degree of respect for their test-making ability the psychometrics department and the test development department, they're good.
Yeah, no question. This test is beautifully built. This is going to make it better from the angle that they're looking to succeed on. If I'm a test taker, though, this makes me nervous. It makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is why we went out and built our own interfaces, because we wanted to be able to see these same type of things. You know, you can't expect LSAC to give that information to us. And it's interesting because I don't know if any listener out there has kind of taken a survey of who really has their own digital interface. Not every company does. And in fact, some of the bigger name companies that are out there, they don't have anything. So it's a real separation point, I think, between the people who are committed to doing LSAT preparation the right way and then the people who are kind of in it for the money.
That's a very cutthroat way to put it, but it's true. Why would you not build an interface that lets your students practice, succeed?
Hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And
well, no, I know why
hours.
You wouldn't, but how do you call yourself like a legitimate company doing this and not have the interface itself? It's ridiculous.
It's the first question that I would ask if I was looking at courses, like, do you have your own digital interface? And if not, why not? Are you really telling me to go to LSAC for this? This is ridiculous.
Or some other company. Yeah.
Exactly. So that was the second blog about how the digital LSAT will shape the LSAT of the future. And then it was just today or yesterday they came out with their most recent Lawfully blog. I have to get that in there. And that's actually this was the one about embracing our histories and embark on our digital future.
Right.
And they gave a short history of LSAC developments, and they put a timeline montage on their website, which is interesting if you're into this kind of thing.
Yeah,
which I don't think
it's cool to click through.
Yeah, and those were sandwiched around another Lawfully blog, which was, hey, the LSAT went all digital with the September administration. And this was interesting because they put out a press release after the July test that really trumpeted this grand success. And I think a lot of people knew that, well, yeah, test completion isn't necessarily a success. I think, what was it, the analogy you used? It was about soldiers. How many people we lost in the war, but it doesn't capture how many people like lost a limb.
98% of them survived. That guy's still on fire, though, and that guy's missing both arms. That's what I was saying.
They were a little more straightforward about it this time.
Not what I call a resounding victory. I guess that was my point.
I appreciate it. The big thing that had come out before the test was we knew there were some weather issues down in Houston and then up in North Dakota. They can't control that. Right. That's beyond their control. That's just something they have to deal with. They did have an error in their shipping process, and so some locations, and I think that was Berkeley. There was one up in the state of Washington as well.
I think it was all West Coast.
Yeah, it had problems. And I was surprised to see them admit that, okay, there was a problem with our shipping process. We didn't realize it. Now we've caught it. We don't think this is going to happen again. That is the kind of transparency that I want to see.
Right.
The thing is I don't want to see it on a blog several days after the test. What I want to see it is on their Twitter account or some other forum that they can come out and speak to students directly.
Yeah, even just a mass email.
Yeah. I think we all understand that there are going to be problems.
Right.
You and I have talked at length about these problems, but I'm going to speak to LSAC right now, and I'm going to say this. Get a crisis management team that is ready and waiting on the days of this test, and don't just clam up and not say anything. Instead, communicate with the students immediately, and not just an email that says, hey, we're working on this, we'll get back to you. Because what has happened is that there are students who, as of this morning, still don't know exactly when they're taking the test. And they're almost assuredly taking the LSAT this Saturday.
Yeah.
But that kind of uncertainty to go through that and be told that, oh, you're going to get a call, you're going to get an email, and these things never show up, that's really frustrating. And I think that's actually their biggest area that they need to focus on now is communication.
Yeah, and people travel for this thing. People book hotels. They need to have a little bit of warning as to when they're going to need to sit for it.
Yeah, there's a post up on Reddit at this moment that is just brutal in terms of it eviscerates them over their conduct and their lack of clear communication. And when you read it, you can imagine the frustration of that person. Yeah. I feel really bad for them. They still are kind of uncertain as to their makeup. They've been told one thing and then another thing. You call the call center and they don't know, you email the person you were in contact with, they don't know, I'm not for it. So,
or you get a different answer from different speakers, basically.
Yeah, I think, in general, there were problems in September. We know that. They're aware of them, obviously. I just think they should be a lot clearer in getting the message out. Now I'll step down.
Completely agree.
Yeah, I'll step down from the podium or the sermonizing, but I hope they're listening, quite honestly, because test is fantastic. The digital tablet has a lot of potential. But if you can't communicate clearly to your clients, and your students are your clients, no matter what you think about the law schools, you're failing.
Yeah. And it's just not that hard to do. Like, they know more than they're telling people right now. Why? Why not just, be transparent about it?
Well, say something to the effect of, this is what we've often done in the past. There's no guarantee, but this is what we're going to try to do for you.
Sure.
Great. Okay, now at least I have an idea of what's going on. Instead of just this open-ended, it might be, we're going to try to reschedule it or what have you. We know that they can't make an instantaneous rescheduling decision until they clear the location, they clear the proctors. We're aware of it. But some of the stuff that happened was, if you especially follow me on Twitter, I've posted about some of those problems up in the Boston area with, proctors not knowing what's going on and just chaotic scenes.
Yeah.
And I'd really like to see them get past that.
So
quickly.
I have 2 questions for you.
Yeah.
And neither one of them is going to be about it being the same test or not, so don't worry about that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think that's a question we'd both prefer to avoid.
We know the answer, and so
in some regards, Do you think it'll be digital, the makeup?
Some of them will and some of them won't.
Fair enough. Do you think they can turn these makeup scores around by the 14th?
Yes, most definitely they can.
Okay, good. Those are the same answers that I was going to give, so.
Yeah.
Happy days.
We're in agreement, man. Woo! I realized for the people who have not taken their test yet or who just took it this past weekend, of which there were a bunch, they're probably thinking, will I get my score? Yes. We actually know they can turn around LSAT scores in as little as 48 hours.
Yeah.
Perhaps less. They just don't often have to do it, but I have seen it done before. And so you can take it several days before the actual deadline, and they can still process it and make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Presumably the tablets help with that too.
That's exactly right.
Because the data's there already, so.
They can just transmit it through.
As we speculate. All right, well, good. That's good news, at least. Good luck to those who still haven't taken it, by the way. We're still rooting for you.
We are. I feel bad for you, though, too.
Well, let's give them some flaw advice that maybe helps.
Yeah, let's move on to the actual LSAT as opposed to all this kind of like peripheral problems.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on to flaw in the reasoning, the last piece of the puzzle, so to speak. What to do when there is no obvious flaw in the stimulus. And let's start off with a brief review of what we've talked about before.
That whole value of knowing common errors and why it's so important. Yeah. As you mentioned at the outset of this, if you haven't listened to the first 3 versions of this flaw series, really, go back and do it. Make that a priority. It's going to be a big question type on the test. And if you know not only what these flaws look like as a stimulus and an argument, but also what they look like as answer choices, you put yourself miles ahead in this game. So that's, to me, how I see it. It's really a 2-part knowledge that you have to have about the common flaw categories. What they look like, how they work, even why they're wrong, and then how the test makers describe them down there in A, B, C.
Exactly. And it's a time-saving device.
Yeah, huge.
Your ability to know these things beforehand and not have to learn it on the fly puts you in a position to move more quickly and more confidently. And anytime you're on solid ground like that, that puts you in an advantage position over the test. You could recognize it if it's in the stimulus, then you just have to find the answer that describes it.
Right.
Or you can see something in an answer choice and say, that's either it, or alternatively, that's not it for sure.
Yeah. But
and eliminate
at
that.
least you'll know when you see, an error of composition described. You'll be like, I know what that looks like. That's not what I just saw. Get rid of answers. So
exactly.
Yeah.
That's a speed issue, and we all know that time kills on this test. So the more time that you have, the better off you are.
And now to interject a note of low-key gloom, a lot of the flaw questions you're going to see, though, won't contain a common error. And that's why we're here right now.
Although the answer choices may still describe them.
Mm-hmm.
But there's that moment that I think everybody's had where you read the stimulus and you think to yourself, this looks good, or that seems pretty normal. And then you go to the question stem and then it says, which of the following best describes the flawed reasoning above, or something like that. And you think, what flaw?
Flaw? What? Yeah.
I didn't see that. And that's a terrible moment, because you're like, right then you've been informed that you missed something.
Right.
Which is useful, because it means that as you read it, you didn't pick up every piece of information. And so you have to quickly reassess the situation. But at least now you've been added, you've got value added.
Right.
You have new information that's telling you there is a problem there.
I will say, as a default mode on this test, expect every question to contain a flaw. That's how I feel about it.
The majority do.
Most of them do. And when they're there and you're already primed to look for it, it really, again, puts you out ahead of the curve, so to speak.
I think that's actually a really interesting and valuable point to restate. You have to be skeptical.
Yeah.
Your whole mode of thinking here should be, I'm a skeptic. I don't know if I'm buying this. I think there might be a mistake in it.
Yeah. Credulity is a killer on the LSAT, man. It is about as bad of an outlook as you can really have going into this thing.
Yeah, everything is not like sunshine and moonbeams and all this kind of stuff. It's like, there's a problem here, and I think there's going to be a problem. That's a much better mindset to have than like, it's going to be just fine.
Yeah, pessimists tend to win on this test a lot. So
pessimists in terms of being skeptical.
That's what I mean, expecting something to go wrong in the author's argument.
I don't think you mean on the whole, like, I'm pessimistic about how things are going. I'm just talking about, like, what's this person going to say? And am I buying this, or is there some kind of flaw in it? Look for the flaw at all times when you're reading.
That's really what I mean. And then, of course, in the answers too, 80% of them are wrong. Why would you ever be confident that A was going to work out? It's the worst math, right?
Because you got to have hope, John. Always one of them is right.
Maybe by the end of this Manhattan.
It's the glass half full. You're like, 80% of them are wrong. I'm like, but 20% of them are right.
That's true. My glass is no longer half full. So maybe hope is brewing, Dave.
Empty. So then you have that moment, though, where you're like, there is a flaw there and you missed it.
Right.
How do you approach it from that moment on? What are you attempting to do?
Well, I think you have to go back to the nature of what the question type itself is, which is really an abstract must be true question. It's a lot like method of reasoning, which is abstract must be true. Knowing the nature of how these have to behave, even when they don't have the common flaws that you can instantly slap a name to or a letter to, whatever, you do know how a flaw question in general has to function, how it has to operate. And that to me is if this is a worst case scenario, I didn't realize there was a flaw till they told me there was one, I don't recognize what it is. If that's worst case, it's still very survivable if you know how flaws function. And that's what I think we should really devote some time to here.
This kind of like as you said, abstract must be true aspect.
Yeah, the operational nature of flaw questions, even if you can't put a name to them.
Yeah, I think the comparison to the flaw and method idea, I often think of flaw and method as the same question, but you get more information with a flaw. Mm-hmm. But if you can't capitalize on that, if you don't recognize that flaw, then you have to go into default method of reasoning approaches.
Right.
And that approach is to say, well, what happened? What really occurred in the stimulus? And which of these answer choices describes something that is in fact occurring?
Yeah.
And so that puts you into a position where, when you think about it almost categorically, if you're going to find an answer, you're now limited to the stimulus. Mm-hmm. And this isn't news to anybody. I mean, any must be true type of question.
Classic must.
Yeah, is the same kind of thing. But that's why we call this an abstract must be true in certain respects. Mm-hmm. You must focus on the information in the stimulus and what actually happened. So whenever I'm looking at an answer choice in one of these questions, and I'm like, I don't see what the flaw is, the first thing I'm looking to say is, did that actually occur?
Yeah. It's like the fact test in must.
That's exactly what it is. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to point to the area in the stimulus where it says, okay, undermined a theory. Did they undermine something? Yeah. And was there a theory?
Challenges an authority. Did they really, though? Is that what just happened?
Did they make a challenge? Was there an authority?
Right.
And then usually there's more to the answer. So I'm looking at it at, as you said before, granular level, where it's piece by piece. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to say every little part has to match up. And so that information in the stimulus becomes incredibly valuable because you're using that to say this is where this occurred in this particular answer.
I use that word a lot, match. This is really just a matching exercise. First and foremost it is.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. You have to be able to say, they're talking about this, and this is where it happened. Mm-hmm. And that's a skill that, Sesame Street's been trying to teach people. Not to say this is as easy as Sesame Street, because we know that it is not. But that's a really important point to realize that the skill involved here isn't inherently difficult. It is something that humans are very good at. The reason it's tough is because the language they use in the answers and sometimes in the stimulus is deceptive.
Yeah, slippery.
Or it could be difficult to actually parse, like, what is a theory in this instance? Or what's the difference between a theory and a principle, as the case may be, in a stimulus or an answer choice? The other part of that is that as you're looking at those answers, that gives you this litmus test where if you see that a part has occurred, all right, I can go on to the next section of that answer choice. But if I see something and it didn't happen, I automatically know that that answer just got sorted into the wrong answer category.
Yeah, it's very definitive at that point, which is a great feeling.
Yeah, it becomes one of your 80% of wrong answers. You can
yes,
put
it
that
does. There it is.
In the empty glass and fill it up.
But it's not close enough in these questions, I guess is a point to make here. Man, this answer seems pretty good. No, it's got to really match start to finish perfectly. It can't misdescribe anything. It can't contain extras. That's what we're really looking for. That's how deliberate and decisive you can be.
Well, that's that abstract fact test. Mm-hmm. Where it's like if an answer describes an event that didn't occur, then it's wrong. And what you just said there made me think of another important point, which is, well, this answer looks pretty good. It's not about how good it looks. It's whether or not it matches or not. And one of the things that you often see, I see it online a lot, especially in our LSAT forum where we talk to students about specific questions and try to help them out. A lot of times I see people arguing for answers.
Oh, yeah. They root for them. That's what I mean a little bit by the pessimism idea.
Yeah. And I think that's a great idea of
right answers don't need your help. That's kind of the key to that, right? I'll give you my favorite version of this, and by favorite I mean I wish people would stop it. But it happens enough that it's important to talk about, which is where people pick an answer choice simply because they know what it means.
Ooh, that's a good one too.
Yeah, I know what a source argument is, and I'm not sure if it happened up there, but I know what it is.
Well,
that drives me nuts.
Here's the classic question. You are looking at two answers, and one of them says source argument, and you're not really sure that there was a source argument, but you know what a source argument is. Mm-hmm. And the other remaining answer choice in contention, you don't really know what it says. Which one should you pick?
Well, if you can rule out the things that you know, you pick whatever's left.
Yeah. If you see an answer and you know what it means, but you don't really like it, choose the one you don't know anything about.
Sure.
That is like that should be your default from a test taking standpoint, because you would if you feel bad about an answer, that answer is going home. All right.
Yeah.
Don't take it. But the idea of justifying answers is something that I see people doing all the time. They become what you said, cheerleaders. They're like, I really liked A. It kind of was close to what I was thinking. So now all of a sudden I'm finding reasons that it's right. Mm-hmm. And if you have to find reasons to justify an answer, boy, you're already putting yourself in a dangerous position, because as you said, right answers don't need your help. Mm-hmm. They are correct. So usually when people start telling me, no, but this is what I thought, and I thought it did this, I'm like, yeah, but did it really do that? Well, not exactly. I'm like, not exactly means you're wrong.
Right. There was a drill I used to do back in the early days of teaching this stuff. And I'll still dust it off every once in a while, but I would go through a set of logical reasoning or a set of flaw questions with the answer key and mark out every right answer. Because that to me that's just the place you're going to land when you can tell me what's wrong with the other four. And that's all I would try to do for every wrong answer. So 100 wrong answers for a set of logical reasoning. Can I give a definitive reason? Can I point to the word or the idea within each of these answers that I know are wrong? So there's no pressure. You can't miss a question. The right answers are off the table. But can I tell myself or someone else why A fails or B fails, knowing that it does? And I think that's what really good test takers are able to do. Some can articulate it a little better than others, but in their own minds, they can still point to the reasons that answers should go away.
That's really the teaching test that we talk about. Whereas, can you explain these problems to other people? Except in this case, you've focused it in on just the answers.
Right.
Where you're saying, show someone else why everything's wrong here.
Yeah. It also helps to really ingrain that mindset of like, A is probably going to be wrong. So just start looking for failures, because that's 4/5 of what you are about to see.
Is that LSAC's new slogan? Expect failure?
Yeah.
Because 80% of what we put on this test is, by definition, incorrect.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how the wrong answers often mimic the test makers in some regards. It's like, that's a clever way to be wrong.
Oh, man. I like that.
Cheap shot.
Yeah, so if you are attempting to justify an answer and to cheerlead it and be like, I really think this is the right answer, and you're giving reasons that aren't automatically provable based upon the stimulus, you're probably in the wrong. So it's something to think about as you go through this, because I think a lot of people get into that mindset. And I think there's a blog that I wrote a while back after I think I'd helped somebody who just wanted to argue with me constantly. And I was like, you're not arguing with me. You know, they'd actually put in the message, they're like, Dave, I don't mean to be contrary to you. And I was like, you're not being contrary to me. I don't actually have a stake in this. You're arguing with LSAC.
Yeah.
And they don't care, because they say what the right answer is and they say what the 4 wrong answers are. And your mindset towards that is actually completely irrelevant.
Yeah. I keep waiting for the day that they change the answer key because the student complains hard enough. It's
we
never
feel as if B's pretty good.
Yeah. We changed our mind, guy.
Somebody sent them a message recently that was like, I don't feel that this makes sense. And it was from a test from years ago. And I think they sent a message back that says, we're under no obligation to provide explanations.
Ooh.
And I was like, that is actually a reasonable response on their part. Not how I would have said it, because I don't think it's the most diplomatic response.
Well, the whole "we don't owe you anything" go away is not. Yeah, diplomatic's a good word for what that's not.
Yeah, I often think that if we ran our business that way, we'd be in big, big trouble.
We'd be talking about it in the past tense is what we'd be doing, I think.
Yeah, we wouldn't be here.
Nope.
Anyway, get back to the point of how this works. You can't cheerlead. You have to go through this using this fact test that we use for method and flaw questions. And this applies just as equally to a method question as it does to a flaw question where you didn't recognize the flaw. So
that's number 1, step 1. Answers have to be accurate in what they describe. They have to match what actually occurred in the stimulus. There are 2 answer constructions or phrasings that I want to touch on really quickly, and obviously I expect you to chime in too. There's common forms that they often use when you don't get a categorical flaw. And anyone who's spent much time with this test has seen both of these. The first version is essentially like the author overlooks the possibility, the author fails to consider, ... whatever else. The other version, and when I say version, I mean just common construction, is something like the author presumes without justification, or the author takes for granted. I think a lot of times people conflate those 2 ideas, fails to consider and takes for granted, as though they're saying something similar to one another, but in many ways they're actually saying opposite things, as I see it. To fail to consider means it needs to be missing, overlooked, absent. To take for granted means it needs to be there, whether explicit or just an underlying assumption. Those are very different circumstances. But you have to understand what both of those answer forms are presenting to you, because they come up so often, especially in the types of questions we're talking about right now.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And to go down a slight rabbit hole, the second of those forms that the author presumes without justification, this has to be something that typically is then an assumption of the author's argument.
Right.
So what I often say is, okay, is it an assumption? And it's a rare thing that you would need to do it, but you could actually negate the answer and see whether or not it is an assumption. This works for method as well.
Sure.
And then whether or not it was presumed without justification. So like a second level. Was it an assumption, and was it unreasonable to presume that?
Are you confident the author believes this thing, but don't really have a good reason to agree with him on it, or her on it? What I think is interesting about the other form, the fails to consider, overlooks the possibility, that's a really easy thing to make true. Every argument in the world fails to consider thousands, millions of things. The author fails to consider, what kind of shoes I'm wearing. It's true. But, and this is where we really get into the second part of what an answer demands or requires for flaw to be correct, it also has to be relevant. It has to be some central tenet of the argument that causes it to be less than 100%, less than guaranteed, in terms of the author's ultimate belief. So fails to consider, people look at those and the author does fail to consider that. How this might affect crime rates or what it'll do to traffic. It's like, all right, but if you then brought that up, pointed that out, would the author recoil a bit? Would the author backtrack? Because that's what needs to happen when something failed to consider is then introduced.
That's the classic personalization scenario.
Yeah, it's a good time for it.
Yeah, and I've often said this. Sometimes when I'm looking at the arguments being made in the logical reasoning section and then the answer choices, when I get into this kind of like fails to consider or even a weakened scenario, it's almost like I'm at a news conference and the author is the person at the podium and they've just read their statement, which is the stimulus. And then I'm the guy that's standing up with, these answers. And the question is, as you said, did they fail to consider it? Well, in many instances, they have failed to consider it.
Yeah.
But was it relevant? So if they had some argument and I stood up and I said, you failed to consider the color of shoes that John was wearing. The author might be like, you're right, I did fail to consider that, but nobody cares because we're talking about fishing rates in the sea and overfishing.
They're burgundy, by the way, right now.
Are they?
Yeah.
That's sweet.
Thanks, Phil.
Are you actually wearing shoes?
No.
I knew it. Neither am I for that matter.
No, I'm not wearing shoes. I hate shoes.
Shoeless. I am also anti-shoe.
I was wearing burgundy on the flight back from New York, and I got me some interesting looks.
Stylish as ever.
Something like that. But that idea of relevant fails to consider. It's like, does the absence of this consideration affect the argument in a harmful way? That's when an answer choice like that is correct.
Yeah, and if you stood up at the news conference and you have the right answer in something where it's been failed to consider or even a weakened situation, when you stand up and say it to the author will immediately be like, now I've got to backpedal.
Touché, yeah.
And that backpedaling either shows that you're weakening the argument or that there was a flaw of some sort. It's really the same thing, but there was a problem. And so in this type of question, that then becomes the right answer. It had to be overlooked and it had to be relevant to the argument at hand. And that personalization aspect is something that, for me at least, I'm always thinking about as I go through this. To me, it's a battle of wills, me versus the author.
It's a little combative in that regard. I'm constantly picturing faces when I read things on this test and think about how I'd respond.
Emojis?
Well, no, more just very... like Mr. Bean or somebody, like Jim Carrey, a very expressive face.
I'm worried about this conversation because I do not want to suddenly pick up this trait as I go through the test.
No,
it's a Jim Carrey answer.
It's a steady decline into madness, I think. A steady but precipitous decline. But yeah, what is this going to put a smile on their face? Then it's a good strengthening thing. Are they going to be indifferent to this? Then it doesn't have any effect, probably. Are they going to hate that I brought this up and feel a little foolish, a little embarrassed? Then it's a good flaw or a good weaken. And again, I guess what would it be, personification of some type, where you could look at an argument and assign human traits to it, to anthropomorphize the argument.
Exactly.
Yeah. It makes it more visceral, it makes it more tangible. And to me, it keeps you kind of in the moment. It's not as clinical as some people make it from that regard. And I think for a lot of folks out there, that's an important psychological trick.
That's another point that I find kind of fascinating when you think about it, when you talk about this clinical approach. Mm-hmm. And I've said this before. I remember some of the first classes I ever taught, I used this example where I was like, a lot of people think, okay, it's the law school test. It's all about logic. And so they want to put on a white lab coat and get really scientific and clinical about breaking things down. And I'm like, that's actually the wrong way to go about it. You want to have all that knowledge about how things break down, but instead you want to make it much more real. As you said, visceral, where you're right there with these answers. Because what that does is that engages you in analyzing the material. Most people are very good at arguing. All you have to do is watch them with their significant other, have an argument, and they're like, ooh, these two are really going
spoken like a married man, but yeah.
I'm fortunate.
Spoken like a father of a 7-year-old.
No, she's a really good girl, and my wife is very cool, so we fortunately don't argue all that much. Plus, I mean, she's smart enough to know that
Come on now,
shouldn't be arguing with me.
The 7-year-old?
She hasn't learned that lesson
No,
yet.
I don't think she knows.
I'm going to tell my wife, don't listen to this.
She'll figure it out.
She'd laugh if she actually heard me say that.
Yeah, so it becomes a twofold approach. You have to be clinical in the sense of reading with precision, being extremely deliberate and judicious about the decisions you make, what you allow yourself to think, to paraphrase, to abstract, as it were here, which is what this really is about. But you can also have some fun with the idea of like, all right, let's put some gloves on. Let's see who gets bloodier, right? You can actually get in there and tousle a bit. Oscar Wilde, this is going to be a little bit of a sidetrack, but hear me out.
I will.
Oscar Wilde wrote in a letter to his ex-lover, for whom he was unjustly imprisoned, that one of the greatest deficiencies in his former dude was that he always lacked the ability to play gracefully with ideas. And I just think that's such a beautiful phrase. Can you play gracefully with ideas? That to me is the more almost artistic side of what good test takers do on this test. Yeah, I just always thought that was a pretty phrase. But it reminds me when I go through this test of like, look, you have to be nimble and a little mentally agile, gymnastic in how you deal with this stuff. But you can then marry that to something that is much more precise and much more clinical, cold, black and white.
So you're describing it almost like a ballet.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny.
It's choreographed. You know the dance, but you also have to be fluid in your movements and graceful as you play with ideas.
And I think that's a good description. It's funny to me because I tend to think of it more like a street brawl. Where I'm trying to slug down these wrong answer choices, and protect the right ones. And I'm getting hit in the back of the head. Somebody's trying to take out my legs.
But is it like a proper street brawl where you just every man for himself and it's just flying fists? Or is it more like a Hollywood's version of a street brawl where everything's coordinated and put your foot there and swing this high?
It's more like a superhero version of a melee.
I see.
Where I can't be touched. And then I beat all the attackers. But that idea, regardless of how you look at it, whether it's a graceful ballet and playing with ideas in that manner, or more like I'm slugging it out with this test, it doesn't really matter which one speaks to you more strongly. And it could be that maybe it's a street brawl ballet that we have going on.
There you go.
A mashup of the two. That's
West
the kind
Side
of thing.
Story kind of thing? Is that what
Yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Something where you at least see this for what it is, which is that there are moments where things happen in a predetermined way. There's also reactions that you have to make, and you have to be, I think this is the right word no matter what, you have to be nimble.
Yeah.
You have to be quick, and I won't go any further with that. But the idea is that you can't be caught unawares. You have to constantly be engaged with this and looking at it very closely. And as long as you do that and you focus on the fact that everything that you need to answer the question is actually sitting in the stimulus, you will be able to negotiate these questions correctly and confidently.
Yeah, what a good point. I mean, because this for a lot of people is the scariest thing to happen. I know there's a mistake and I don't know what it is, but there's not just ways around that, there's ways straight through it. Yeah.
And this is the way.
This is the way.
It seems rather simple because we've just turned it into a big must be true question, but that's exactly what it is. So as long as you look at it through that filter, then you can, even if you use like identifiable flaws to eliminate 3 answers, that gives you 2 answers. Now you approach it with the fact test and you're able to separate out what happened from the stimulus to what happened in each answer choice. And you can kill off, hopefully, the one remaining wrong answer choice and select the correct answer.
Yeah. I see people do this all the time with great success by just following the idea of which of these seems to be a closer match. I think if you can keep that idea in mind, you're always going to have a safety net here.
Yeah, and keep in mind also that the test makers love to play around with things where it's like they give you something that's only partially the case.
Right.
They love answers that start off and you're like, and that's right exactly what happened in the stimulus. You're like, this is looking good. Because then people get that confidence factor of like, yay, I found the right answer.
The pom-poms come out. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't let a good beginning end up kind of like convincing you that the rest is pretty good, even though it's just, hellacious.
It becomes prejudicial in that way. You read the first half and like it so much that no matter what happens from then on, you're biased to think that answer is going to be the one.
Yeah, you
Can't
want
be
to
that
like
way.
it.
Skepticism till the end.
Yeah, that partially true answer is a classic wrong answer on any flaw or method question.
Yeah.
Or answers that bring in something that didn't happen, that that is new. And so when you are focusing on these type of answers, be aware that they're trying to deceive you. They want to see if you are circumspect enough to get through an answer choice and see it for what it is. It has to be 100% right. It cannot be 80% right. It cannot be 90% right. Everything has to match up. You have to be able to say, this is where it happened in the stimulus, and it's piece for piece matched up.
I love it. So even if you can't name the flaw, you can still win the street fight.
Or the ballet.
Can you win a ballet?
Win a ballet?
Yeah.
Maybe so.
Are they graded? I don't know how that works.
I'll have to ask Amanda.
Yeah,
since
your
she
wife
used
would
to
know.
own a ballet studio. She'll know whether or not you can win a ballet, but I'm sure she will laugh at me and be like, that's a ridiculous question. Yeah. Of course you can't.
All I know is I can lose a ballet. I'm confident in that.
I can too.
Mostly because I wouldn't wear shoes.
Well, you could wear those maroon shoes that you love so much.
Oh, God,
burgundy, whatever color they are.
They wouldn't let me in the theater.
I'm sure they would if you had the cash to get in.
Well, there you go.
All right. I think that wraps it up for us, does it not?
Yeah, I think it does. I'm glad we had a chance to bring this back into the fold, though. It felt a little incomplete talking about all these flaws without this conversation.
Yeah, I know that you were very strongly wanting to have this discussion, and I second that because I think it's a really useful way to cap off this kind of like multi-piece discussion of flaw in the reasoning question and common flaws. Mm-hmm. So, again, if you haven't had a chance, go back and listen to this entire series arc of discussions on this topic. Next time we're back, we're going to talk about something else. So we'll figure that topic out as the day goes on. But if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, or anywhere else you find it. Give us a rating. And if you have questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com or lsat@powerscore.com. On behalf of both John and myself, have a great week, and thanks so much for listening.